Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the International Schools Podcast. I'm your co-host, John. Lovely to be back. Uh, for many people, I think either they've finished their spring holidays or they're starting them or you're recovering from them. But spring is in the air if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're looking forward to lighter, uh, more light and better temperatures. One of the things that I think we have over the hundreds of episodes that we've done, it's hard to believe, is that we've talked a lot about AI as a system. We talked about AI as the technology, the tool, the impact on society. But really today, what I really wanted to do, and I feel really excited that we have our guest, is let's go to the classroom. What is it like in the trenches? If you're teaching full time and you've got this artificial intelligence technology, large language models, you have data privacy, you have students of all other ages, very, very likely using it at home. They can't maybe use it at school, or there's limited access. There are all kinds of complexities that come about when you think of AI in the context of a classroom. As a teacher, you might be leveraging it for some workflows. You might actually getting some lessons done. You might even have moved to agentic AI. There are many different opportunities. And then also, how are your students? What are you doing maybe to engage students to reflect on the role of AI, the ethics, how to use the tool, understanding that they might be using the tool more as a transactional where they're just getting answers, but you might want to shift them more to a kind of a metacognition, thinking partner as a critical friend. And all these different flows become quite complex because as a teacher, you have a million other things to do: attendance, report cards, duty, and all this seems a lot. But I think it's important to understand, and I think it's here to stay. It's in the schools, and the kids and our students are using it often outside of the context of the school with very little supervision or supervision depending, and as young as 2 and 3 already being exposed to it. So brings a whole new shift, how we digest that, how we engage with it. We're all going to have different places we enter and manage that. But today I have somebody that I actually had the pleasure, I was keynoting, and they were on the panel, and I follow him on LinkedIn. He's super provocative, always questioning, and that's John Dolman, who's a media studies teacher at Ponteland Community High School. For those that don't know where that is, that's not too far from Newcastle, a little bit outside of Newcastle. He has a master's in educational leadership and a postgraduate certificate in education from Newcastle University. He's worked in schools in the United Kingdom and Malaysia, the United Arab Emirates, and he has taught English and media. He's held leadership roles, head of languages and cultures, and raising achievement deputy. He's responsible for many different things, but one thing that I know and why I enjoy his posts, he's a very thoughtful, very reflective practitioner in the classroom, and is always thinking about what does this mean inside work at school and what does it mean outside of work. So John, a real pleasure to have you today. Welcome to the International Schools Podcast.
Thank you very much. And wow, that's quite the introduction. So thank you. Very flattered.
You're very welcome. So John, I think I'd just like to start with, because you're teaching, let's just give context. You're teaching high school. So this would be in the UK curriculum, A levels and O levels. Am I correct?
It is, yes. Currently, and obviously international variants when I was abroad.
Yeah, and so your kids are between the ages of 14 and 18.
Actually, we're a full-blown high school, so 11 through to 18.
Oh, 11 through 18. So I think one of the things I'd like to ask you, because you're very prolific at sharing and reflecting and giving resources and questioning things when you post on LinkedIn on this topic. When did it first feel real to you as a teacher? And maybe what moment pulled you in and what's kind of changed the way you think?
Interesting. I think I mean, I distinctly remember going right the way back to November 2022, or it would have been probably December 2022, and a colleague of mine running in incredibly excited at the discovery of this new thing, ChatGPT, had come out. And he was an EAL teacher. And he said, "This is going to revolutionize teaching. It's going to just change everything." And the energy that he had in that conversation. And I took a look, and I had a play and was a bit underwhelmed. I thought we had an interesting frippery, a Christmas cracker novelty to, at the time. It could produce interesting haikus. And I remember we were using it. This was back when I was teaching in Malaysia. And a colleague of mine even used it for a really nice use case, created a section of his report where we talked about what we were doing that particular term in our classes, and he wrote it as a Shakespearean sonnet because we were covering Shakespeare, and he used ChatGPT to convert these words into a Shakespearean sonnet. But in those first few months, it kind of just fell. It didn't really hit hard. It wasn't until, and I remember it really distinctly. I was producing a report for it was a very formulaic piece of writing for an inspection. And I had all of this data that I needed to convert into a really specific and very rigorous format. And I had it, and I'd formatted much of it. And I thought, right, okay, this seems to be the kind of task that this ChatGPT should be able to have a go at. I'd begun to understand a little bit about how it worked. And I took the information. I said, this is the content. Here's what I want. And I put it in, and it came out, and there was little or nothing left to do with it. And I suddenly thought, oh, hang on. There is something. The amount of information conversion that a teacher is doing. I mean, it's one of the key things we do. Information transfer is not the sole extent of our lives, but it is a component. And suddenly that idea of taking information and turning it into something else, that clicked. And I was also teaching a fairly little known text with very few resources. And I was able to generate new material, generate shadow exam questions, because this was the first time this text had been on the exam syllabus. It wasn't well studied. There's not a lot of guides out there, and you were really working hard to generate material for my A-level students. And it was at this stage, so coming up to about 3 years ago now, that it really clicked that this could be incredibly useful for me as a teacher in generating resources. It was when I moved schools, but then I kind of put it down for a bit, got caught up in the act of moving between continents, moving from Malaysia to the Middle East. And it was moving back there when I started to see students using it. And I really realized the level of kind of penetration across education, both in terms of obviously teachers would be becoming aware of it, but certainly students were using this. And it was, in fact, actually a student of mine who put me onto my favorite tool. I'm quite a fan of Anthropic's Claude model. That's my primary mode of work for material that I use. It was a student of mine who put me onto that, said this was something he used to bounce ideas off and use as a thinking partner. And it was at that stage where I realized, oh, okay, that something has significantly shifted and changed. And I don't know how many people are aware of this. I was looking around at groups of teachers, most of whom weren't anywhere near an AI platform. They'd heard of ChatGPT, but that was about it. So yeah, it was about 3 years ago, and seeing how it could take language and just shift its form almost at will, as it were. It had that magic moment of you can transform material from one form to another. And given that that's an awful lot of what we do, spending our time doing, just to generate resources, I realized there was something really special going on. And there've been so many shifts and changes since then. But to come back to that idea of what shifted and changed, that's really a very systems focused way of thinking about it. I think, as you said, we think of it in this transactional way. And since then, I've really pivoted to thinking about this as helping develop my thinking of cognitive extension, where I get it to challenge, to question, to develop, to explore ideas. I ask for multiple variants of something, and that's really how my thinking has shifted, of seeing this not just as a very exciting resource creator, but as something that can really help me think very deeply. I embed, when I'm using Claude, I have my projects are set up with embedded teaching with pedagogical structures built in. It knows that we tend to work with Rosenshine principles, and I use a lot of cognitive load theory, particularly because I'm dealing with students with very varied abilities. So I have that in there, and I get it to explore and challenge the lesson flows to see how effective they can be, and constantly pushing me to do more and be better. So I think using it as that thinking part, and I think I've heard it described as using it as a sparring partner, almost getting it to challenge me, to push me further.
Yeah. And I really like the way you described the moment where you had to do something for an inspection. And I can imagine those are not fun, and they're text heavy and they're very specific, and you have to do it a certain way. And that's just a great moment where suddenly you realize, oh, this thing can do that. That's good.
Yeah.
But I think also what's important that you're highlighting is this shift that you have made at it being a thinking partner, a sparring partner. And I think that's where we're seeing, I think, if you read a lot of research, and myself and other educators like yourself that are using it, that's really the value added proposition of these tools. So when you talk to your students, and in many of your reflections, you always highlight some perspectives of them. What are they already using outside of school? And does it show up in school, or is there two different worlds that they live in? There AI that they get to use in school in a maybe more curated, not caged, but more monitored fashion. And then once they walk out on their cell phones or in their ecosystems, like their social media or gaming platforms.
Certainly, I think it's both, and I think the University of Oxford just a few months ago released some research. They surveyed a massive number of students. I can't put an exact figure on it, but we're talking tens of thousands, and they were discovering like 96% of students across most age ranges have used AI in some respects for their schoolwork. When I've surveyed students, I get a very similar result. To the point at which I've looked at surveying various year groups, and at least 2/3 of students have completed an entire piece of work using an AI platform in that very transactional fashion. But interestingly, in dialogue with students, particularly, and I remember having this conversation with one of my sixth formers a year ago, and talking to them about it, and they were actually using it quite thoughtfully. They described using it as a Socratic tutor, basically getting it to question them. And when you do scratch beneath the surface, particularly as students are approaching those key critical exam moments, and I find this more with the older students, they're naturally, their cognitive development has gone a bit further. They're learning fewer topics. They view education maybe less transactionally. I think here in the UK, because we test at 16 and we test across a very wide range of subjects, students are really obsessed with just getting to the next screen, getting through, which naturally leads to that seeing education as a transaction. Once you push past that, students actually seem to change the way they use AI to something a bit more thoughtful. And we are seeing it crop up every day. We are, of course, hitting the wall, the dreaded wall that I know many people who have a dim view of AI fear that this is what it will be used as. We're seeing AI plagiarism. We do see that students copy, but we saw that with Wikipedia. I've seen more of it since AI has been around. I think I've seen the same amount. It's just a different kind. They're copying and pasting from somewhere else. And it's just teaching students what and how and where to use it, I think is really interesting. One app that has cropped up that's been a bit of a nightmare for us has been ByteDance's Goth Math, which is a great app because it'll photograph a mathematical equation and walk you through the solution, but it does give the solution, which means that quite a lot of our maths department are complaining the homework seems to get completed with incredible accuracy and unbelievable speed because they use an online platform to see how long students are on. And that's one of the issues I think that we encounter. There's two things going on. Students, when they get to a certain point, use this as cognitive extension in the way we would want them to, Socratic dialogue, getting it to test them, generating past new exam questions, getting feedback on their responses. But there's also the cognitive offloading. I just want to get this task out of the way so I can go and do something more interesting, so I can go and play, I don't know, whatever game is de rigueur these days. I'm so away from that. It would be unbelievable going and scroll endlessly through Instagram or TikTok. There's that tension at work, and I think the younger the student, the more the temptation is to be transactional. And I think it's that because their metacognitive development is in a very different place. But interestingly, also, I find students are sometimes using it for just mucking around, having fun. I was talking to some tutees of mine, and they were talking about just cartoonifying their own photographs and making like little cute images of each other. The issue there, of course, is I think students are not always aware of what's happening with their data. They don't understand the difference between the paid subscription and the subscription that you pay, that's free and will train on your data, and then what happens to all of that material. So that is a concern. But yeah, it's cropping up. We're seeing it a lot, both in good ways and bad ways.
Do you think, have you had issues, because there's a lot in the press about deep fakes and cyberbullying, and also, if you go down the kind of alarmist view, there's predators and things like that. How much of that are you hearing, or maybe it's much harder to hear about it because kids aren't going to be open about it in a school setting, but do you sense that this is really part of their lives, even the bad and the good?
It certainly is. It's not maybe as prevalent as news stories would have, but then again, we have mean world theory. As a media studies teacher, I can't help but bring a bit of media studies theory into this. The idea that negative news generates mean world mean world view. We think the world is worse than it is. There have been a very small number of incidences that we've had to deal with. That's just the reality of things. But they are vanishingly few. I think on the whole, kids tend to have reasonably good intent, and they're no more malicious than they ever have been. They are in a situation where this is something that we know when the issue that Grok, the nudification app, that the tool that was built into it, things like that happen. Students are wiser than I think we give them credit for. Most of my students won't go anywhere near X. Firstly, they're not interested. Secondly, they recognize it for the kind of dangerous environment that it can be. And we also do teach about this. So we have an RSHE curriculum where these issues are raised. So we do talk to students about this. There have been, like I say, there have been some examples for bad. For me, more of a worry is cognitive offloading. I think that's probably a more dangerous situation because students and adults don't realize it's happening, and that's more problematic.
So you're bringing up this issue of cognitive offloading, which you've mentioned a few times. Would you say that's something that maybe schools need to address more systematic, like strategically? I'm just wondering, as a school or as a school district or as a community, how much are people understanding that this is not going to leave and there needs to be a change? It's a system-wide change. It's not just a new tech tool.
Yeah, I think that's slow to realize. I think in some schools they're there. I think in some environments they're there. I think it's very slow and it's filtering. I'm lucky that I'm working within a small multi-academy trust. So we're a group of about 14 schools, and our CEO is very much on board. We recognize that this is something, so there is a whole trust move, but that's not always smooth. It's not always the same in every school. The contexts are very, very different. And I think this is something that we have been a little bit slow to grasp the nettle of. We recognize, so the UK government has produced some guidelines and then some product safety standards for AI in education. And it recognizes the issues of cognitive offloading, where if you don't do the work, if you don't struggle, if you don't think through something, you don't develop those pathways, you don't get the learning. So I've tackled this with students. So one of the things that we are trying to do is develop AI literacy. We're starting top down, working with our older students, our Key Stage 5, our post-16 students. And we're doing sessions on AI literacy with them. And the metaphor I use is for students to get them to think it's like having a smartwatch that measures your running. If you use it to give you good metrics to help you improve your times, that's great. If you get a personal trainer and give them the smartwatch, get them to do the running, and then give you the watch back, you haven't got any fitter. You might be able to post great times. The results might look good on your fitness app, and on Strava, and when you post on Facebook, look at my times, everyone will applaud you. Then when you come to a race, you're suddenly going to realize that you haven't put in any of that work, and it hasn't done you any good whatsoever. It's finding that balance between how can I use this to assist me, get those metrics, get my personal trainer to help me, or do I eventually give this task to someone else and I get no benefit from it? And I think the whole of education needs to take a look at this, because if we don't surface this, if we don't discuss this with students, and we have a high pressure, transactionally focused, end focused, product based system, students will naturally gravitate towards producing, and the quicker and easier they can do that, the quicker and easier they will, but the less benefit they get from it. And we now, I think, have to flip the script with education and talk about the process far more.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that process, as you highlight, is so important to get them to really think about the different steps, reflect, think about how are they learning, what does good learning look like. These are such important points. When you work with kids, you talk to them, what would generally surprise most adults? Say if you're not in a classroom, or you are in a classroom but maybe not working with AI, because I know you work with AI extensively. What are some things that you think is surprising about students that most adults might not know?
I think that figure I quoted earlier, just how much they're using it and how blasé, we're wowed by this technology because we've seen it coming. It seems new to them. It's just emerged, and particularly students who are now maybe 14 years old. This is a technology that broke through when they were just encountering technologies as well. If we think about that time frame, so students who were 10, 11 years old when ChatGPT came onto the surface, and suddenly AI is embedded in every phone and every laptop. It's in crikey, it's in fridges, it's everywhere. Like, for them now, this is just the world as it is. And I think it's quite surprising for most adults who still either are a distance away from the technology or can see, have noticed its arrival point. It's a really interesting thing that students just accept that it exists, accept that it's a thing, and therefore it's just something that they will use. And I think that's probably the most surprising thing, that for them it's not surprising. For us,
Yeah.
there's a wow factor to it, and then we're also justifiably skeptical and cautious. Students, not so much, particularly the younger ones. They're just, yeah, great, here's this thing that exists, let's go right ahead and use it. In the same way that they're remarkably incautious about the internet because they've always had it. I remember a time before it existed.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting how you highlight this idea that, kids that are 10 now, 3 years later, are basically working with large language models that are so much more powerful and better. If you just think some of the, Claude Opus 4.6 and some of these tools, which they have access to, or they don't, but they have the free versions. I think that's a really important point. You bring up this idea of them being blasé, because it's just it's a bit like, air or a smartphone or whatever it is, a bicycle. It's just part of the decoration, part of the life that they live day to day. If we came to you, what would be a typical week? Where does AI clearly, you feel, improve their learning or workflow, and where does it just add noise for you?
It manages to it very much does both. It's filtering through the latest updates, what people are up to. That's the kind of noise that I have to filter through. But in terms of my practice, I consider myself to be fluent enough that I can cut through that friction that it can introduce when it doesn't quite get something right. So for me, I have, at the minute, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just looking at one of the tabs that's open on one of the 3 Chrome profiles I have open. I think I've probably got about 6 AI windows open on my desktop. Several Google Notebook. I've got my Claude tab open, at least one Gemini, probably a couple of Gemini gems on my work platform as well. For me, it's just incredibly closely integrated. I use voice noting very heavily for doing feedback. It's just embedded in my flow. Resources I create, I will be creating through a co-creation process, either using material that I've got and then just improving it, putting it back into the model and just double checking things, or creating differentiated versions of this material to match the needs of the specific classes, which is incredibly easy now, things that I've dreamt of doing all of the time. So that's my flow. That's it. Just sits there. It's in literally everything I'm doing. Interestingly, front facing with students, it's not something they interact with a lot, because here we don't allow students below the age of 16 access to the tools within school, except for within limited platforms. So we use Canva, so they have access to those tools, particularly for media studies. We sometimes use that, and we talk about it. So in terms of where does it add, for me, it adds fluidity in my workflow. It gives me those capacities. Where there's noise and distraction, it's that for me there isn't, but I recognize that there is for a lot of people. The noise comes from they feel the need to try something and it doesn't quite go right. So I think the distraction of expecting AI to produce a perfect thing straight away and read your mind and also know what the thing is. I think a lot of people talk about, oh, I may as well do it myself. And well, if you'd written a better prompt and you provided it with the correct context, it would probably have done it very, very quickly for you. But I'm able to cut through that. One of the things that I have to do in my role as well is look at training. For instance, I was just running an AI network meeting just before we started this conversation. So one of the things I have to cut through is trying to hone down on what are the issues that we as a school and a trust need to focus on. So trying to narrow it down to the things that will hit widest for most teachers, and where we need our priorities to be in terms of things like what kind of things do we need to be talking to students about. But in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, I do get particularly my sixth form students to use things. So something that we would do fairly frequently is get students to produce a piece of work, and then put it into a large language model with the specifications and get them to deconstruct their own essays. Okay, what went well, what could be put in, or I'll give them an essay and get them to mark it and then give it to the language model so they can look at what did they think, what did it think, and they can start to create things. So again, using it to develop metacognition. Google Notebook is something that we're using a lot with students, getting them to curate collections of resources and getting to work through that idea of being able to interrogate deeply but create revision material, so learning things so you're showing them it as a learning tool. And I think Notebook is we know that it was developed specifically for students, and I do think it's probably the premier tool for schools. And Notebook LM, we're fortunate we're a Google school, so we've enabled that, and that's something that we do work with a lot.
So in your school, you're very likely what they would call, one of these people that's happy to burn on the edge of innovation and be way ahead of everybody. But what are you seeing? So you have 14 schools in your trust, and you're involved in some professional development. Compared to 3 years ago and where you are today, what would you say from your lens? Where are people sitting as educators? What is kind of is it just an arc like when laptops came in or when the internet came in, or is this systemically different?
I think it is systemically different. The curve would look a little different. I think the bell curve was steeper and sharper with laptops. Here you're seeing a longer and flatter curve. You're seeing a much more unusual kind of range of exposure. There's a lot of people within a large flat curve, which goes probably along the lines of using it like an advanced autocomplete or resource generator. A TES web, the tests do a fantastic job of putting resources on. Now people are automating their own. It's like they've all got this in their back pocket. I can make my own slides. I can produce a new worksheet. That seems to be where most people are at. And it's a very long tail of people who do this a lot, people who don't do this very much, but have just experimented. There's a long tail of people who still, I think one of the big resistance points is people feel that it's too technical without realizing that actually a large language model has removed a lot of the technical barriers to being able to do things on computers that have been a real bugbear of mine. I can't code. I can just about read some code, but now I can generate entire HTML plugins for my revision websites. I can produce interactive components, and I'm starting to build out, go even deeper, following the work of Darren Coxon and people like that, looking at vibe coding and seeing what I can produce with that. I could never have done that before. But I think what we tend to see is that where a lot of people haven't shifted their position from 3 years ago. A lot of people are where I was about 3 months into the process from 3 years ago. And the people who really ran with it have gone a very long distance along that curve. And there's a long, like I say, a flat. It's not really a curve so much as a mild swelling, I think.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you describe it as more of a flat swelling than this bell curve, which I think many of us experienced when, the internet came about, laptops, iPads, even when Google search and, Wikipedia, all those different tools. What do you think sometimes what is the common apprehension when you're working with teachers and students? What is is there a common theme about this? I mean, I remember the little kids that I teach, they're 3 and 4 year olds. They always talk about the Terminator and the robot's going to take over, and I understand. I mean, at that age, it's kind of, it's not as nuanced as maybe you want it to be. Mm-hmm. What would you say are the themes that both students and teachers that you're supporting, teaching, and working with? What is their kind of, not resistance, but maybe apprehension?
I think for teachers, the apprehension it's twofold. It's number one, that actually, the first thing is they feel they don't have the time. And I think that is a systemic problem with schools introducing any change. If time isn't set aside, there is this hope, and I've literally just written about this, that it'll just happen. People will work it out for themselves. And this is a real paradigm shift. Not that the technology is difficult. It's extremely easy to access a large language model. In fact, it's actually quite difficult to get away from them. If you do a Google search, Gemini's sitting on top of it, summarizing it for you. What is difficult is making it is the thought process behind understanding what it's doing and understanding how it can be to make it of benefit. To make it more than just a please make me the thing, and a not very good version of the thing comes out. And I think that's the biggest issue, is that teachers feel this is too technical and I don't have the time. And then there is the worry about inaccuracy. And that has been and still is justified to an extent. The models are getting much more accurate, scary accurate, and very, very capable. They still hallucinate. But if you give them context, that becomes reduced right down. And if you're using something like Notebook LM, it can't make anything up. It's a grounded model. It can miss something, maybe. It can misinterpret something, but its rate of hallucination is vanishingly low. I'm saying it can't make anything up. There's still that potentiality is in there, but it's vanishingly low. Its level of accuracy will probably be higher than that of your average human in terms of its ability to scan and synthesize and put together that material. But those are the three things: I don't have the time, it's too technical, and what if it's wrong? I think they're the three things you see from the adults in the room. The children share some of those. They think, oh, it's not very good, because they've looked at the terrible images that got generated with people with 15 fingers, and the early memes of Will Smith eating spaghetti are the things that they still remember, thanks to video generation has done the generative AI community no good whatsoever. And but the other thing is, I think they sometimes think it's boring because it's associated with schoolwork, and it's frequently just a text interface, which they're not terribly interested in.
Yeah. And I think I like the way you highlighted these three areas for teachers, the idea of time, the technical, and also the inaccuracy. I think those are, they're valid. And I think teachers really believe in, this idea of checking sources and reliability. And that's really an important component. As you see these tools and you use them, you have all these tabs open and you're using them a lot. Do you think the way we function, the way your school functions, or schools in general, you as an educator, is this model just going to become redundant, and there needs to be this significant shift, or can we keep going and kind of live in partnership with this, even though we might not be equal partners?
It's an interesting question. I worry because there's two things at work here. There's the curriculums that we have, which are shaped by the end point assessments. So in the UK curriculum in particular, and I think in many curricula around the school, around the world, in many school curricula around the world, sorry, we have high stakes, end of topic examinations, which rely an awful lot on memorization of content, which is then regurgitated in a formulaic fashion to hit a rubric. I think that describes a number of,
I would say that's pretty much every high school kid that is 18 is facing that in some way, in a different language or different format.
They are, and I think the international baccalaureate is one of the few where there's a significant component which is assessed differently, but even that still has.
It's a grade at the end of the day.
It's a grade, and it involves remembering a thing and remembering how the examiner wants to see the thing. And I think that is literally taking information in one form and transforming it into another form, which is precisely what the language models do. And it is an extremely fragile system when we have something that can mirror this. And if we still perceive AI as a system of generating content, and it only gets used like this, and we have a system of schooling which is predicated on the generation of content, you can see that those two are going to intersect, and that's going to be an uncomfortable intersection. It's going to be, let's face it, it's going to be something of a car crash. Those subjects that are more proof against AI, creative subjects, physically artistic subjects where you actually have to produce a something, where you can spend an extended period of time, things like our extended project qualification and theory of knowledge essays, for instance, and presentations that you get with IB, where you have to show your thinking and you arrive in person to talk through your thoughts. Those systems, I think that they will survive. I think the education system is a massive leviathan. It's difficult for it to die. In its current form, it will carry on lumbering forward. As to what value it then produces and what that does to the amount of attendance we have in mainstream education, that's another question. If students realize all of a sudden, well, I can do this, a very, very well motivated student.
Yeah, and I think your point is a really important one, this idea that it can keep lumbering around, because, I mean, let's face it, we still have many places we're sitting in rows like my grandparents did. There's homework and there's tests and there are these rubrics. And so I think your point's an important one. The question is, because, if you look at in the professional world and some of the acceleration, like Slack just announced that they're going to embed AI 30 features within Slack, and Salesforce now gives you a free Slack account where it's really basically it's an agentic assistant that helps you managing your day. I just sometimes wonder how much of that discrepancy can keep going on, and if we're producing kids that are focused on content and knowledge, how does that transfer? But that's, I think, always a bigger question. Coming back down to earth in your situation, when you are working with kids and doing the media literacy, what are some of the key ideas you think the kids, it resonates with them when you talk about AI, and even maybe the ethics, the sense of reliability, checking sources? What are some of the things that you're doing? Because you focus on English and media studies. What are the things that you're saying, wow, that really works? They get that. They know that's important.
What's been really interesting, and I'd recommend to anybody following the work of Victoria Headland, she calls it the AI bias girl. So I've been working with looking at trying to explain to students how the system works, that it's a series of patterns, that it's matching. You're giving it a pattern, some language, some instruction. It's going to its training data and whatever other context you provided and drawing a pattern from it. And it's asking, okay, where is it getting these patterns from? What is in the data and how does that affect things? I did a fantastic piece of work with several classes, just showing using prompts to generate images and looking at what are the biases, like why are these images the ones that we're being shown. It's some really we would do it. So I'm working on a unit, a magazine, historic magazine, looking at Vogue, British Vogue, with my A-level students. It's a set text, and I just got them all to prompt Gemini to give them a typical copy, a typical front cover of British Vogue, amalgamate. And what was stunning was the lack of variation. And that prompted us to have this discussion of saying, okay, so why is it? And I don't know why, for some reason, British Vogue had decided green would be the color that all bar two of the examples were wearing. And we, I was discussing with my colleague, who's my friend, who's the head of media here, saying, why green? Is it green and pleasant land? Is that what it thinks of Britishness? I don't know why. But the structure we were delving into, okay, well, where is it developing these ideas from? And I think that's really, really important. And that's one of the things that's had some of the biggest impact, and students have started to notice and realize that there's something happening here that they need to pay attention to, that there are things in the training data that maybe don't necessarily reflect reality as it is, but perhaps as it's perceived by certain groups of people, the people who provided the training data, for instance. And I think that's a really powerful way of doing it, and using images to do this, just to show where those patterns exist, is a really powerful way of doing things. I did it with asking, we're up here in the northeast of England, as you pointed out, Newcastle, the Geordies. I asked Gemini, we were doing it in school. I asked Gemini to generate a typical Geordie teenager, and we did one for a boy and one for a girl. And it's interesting to see the tropes that it leans into.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, that would be really interesting. But I love that idea that you're provoking them to think about the biases and kind of the gender inequalities and what are the patterns, and making those connections. How did this learn this? Why does it do that? I think those are super important questions, especially when you're talking to and working with older students that are going to go into the world and one day will be decision makers and be using these tools. Would you say that the ethics of AI is something understated in schools? In other words, are we having, as educators, is there enough time being carved out for those? Because the fact is, as these things become more and more intelligent and capable, and now you have coworker and I've just gotten an email, some other company that basically says you won't have to do anything anymore. We've got it all covered for you. Here, meet these different agents. And I'm just wondering, our schools, or even just in the microcosm of your community, are we having these right conversations, or are we too tool focused?
I mean, I think we are, you and I, and the people that we know in the LinkedIn AI bubbles definitely are. The conversations are occurring. Beyond that, if I'm perfectly honest, absolutely not. It very rarely crops up. We've had a few people raise the issue of the environmental impact of AI. That's been briefly mentioned, and we occasionally see it on our PD, personal development, RSHE, whatever you want to call it, those slides that students will see for a discussion of 10 minutes in the morning, maybe once or twice a year. In terms of the ethics, I just don't think it's particularly well understood. I'm not convinced that even reasonably clued up educators know where the data comes from, how it's been labeled, who's doing that labeling. So I'm talking about the extractive kind of working conditions under which data labeling is done, perhaps often in third world countries, all of these issues that exist, the persistent biases. So looking at the idea of bias, the fact that if you're doing something like trying to make a decision about a student's special educational requirements, and you give a model data and you give it a name which indicates a gender, that in itself will steer the model in a direction. And if people don't understand this and don't understand the ethics and behind this and why this happens, it can begin to distort our practice in ways we don't understand. But to answer your question, I think there is very little of that discussion that happens. We're not at that stage where people are well enough aware of it, and they really need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree with you more. And just, and as you've said throughout the podcast, this issue of time. just finding the time to have those conversations. Maybe it's almost a recategorization of what is most important to focus on and to have those conversations. Do you use AI for feedback? You mentioned a bit the kids were using it, and how are you leveraging the power of AI for feedback for students and for yourself? And kind of what are some of the cautions that you curate to make sure kids understand that when they're in a feedback loop with AI and yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, I think because I'm in an essay-based subject where there's a lot of extended writing, this is where it becomes for getting feedback on certain mechanical processes. It's actually fine. It can identify fractured sentences. It can pick up spell checks, but spell check has been able to do that for a very long time. Drop your material into a Word document or a Google Doc, you'll get the squiggly lines, and you can kind of pick it out yourself. It can provide more coherent suggestions. And there's been a lot of studies done recently. Daisy Christodoulou, who runs a British educator who runs the normal marking company, she's been spending a lot of time looking at English writing in particular. And they've run tests and they've identified that actually for mechanical components of writing in particular, AIs are very, very strong. The feedback, the propensity in AI has to be remarkably agreeable, means that for feedback, it isn't necessarily always your greatest friend unless you really prompt it very carefully. You'll tend to go, oh, that's great. It's not. it's like having a very eager Labrador. It's lovely to be greeted by a very happy, bouncy, friendly AI that likes everything you do. It's not necessarily the best feedback in the world unless you have that foresight and that tenacity to say, okay, no, rinse me, be critical. Where are my gaps? I want to steel man this. Let's break it down. I don't tend to use it. I use it for giving students results for, well, I mean, if it's low stakes and it's multiple choice, it doesn't matter. It's either right or wrong. So using platforms that will do that, very, very straightforward, happy to do that. When I produce feedback, and I do use my AI systems for feedback, I have a very specific workflow because I still want to see everything my students are doing. So I use a gem, which I set up with my very specific, because in our school, we have a very specific feedback format. We give positive, errors, next steps. So we use a PENS format. I literally brought this to the school back in 2012 when I was working here before I went abroad, and we've embedded that ever since. So I have my gem set up with my feedback structures, the specific feedback criteria, depending on what it is I'm marking, whether that's an exam or whether it's a particular essay. And I will then mark a student's work just with a green highlighter, and I'll chat away to myself with the voice note open. And it will then take my comments and it will turn them into articulated feedback with specific actions. So again, it's that textual transformation that I find is very useful for feedback. For students, I'm very clear with them. I say, if you're going to get feedback, you need to supply it with the specification, you need to give it the mark scheme, and you need to be very, very critical of the feedback it gives you. Just be very aware of the fact that it will probably pitch way higher than you need it, and just be cognizant of that. I'm still a little skeptical of its capacity to give feedback for the reasons like I said, it's sycophantic in its nature. So unless you really ask it to be critical, it's not built for that.
And I think something that you've brought up a few times throughout the conversation is this idea that you're creating within the large language models that you use, like, for example, Gemini, these gems, or they're called workbooks or projects, where you're really kind of creating not guardrails, but you're creating an environment of you have the knowledge of the topic, and you know what the good research is and what are the good articles, and really making sure the AI is referencing that. So when it's producing within the framework that you feel, like you gave the example of the pen, positive, error, and next steps. I think that is just really important point that you bring up, and I think that's so powerful for kids to understand that and see that, and also as you work with other educators to highlight that within these tools you can have some controls and they can be effective, but it's really about some of the heavy lifting you have to do. I
Yeah.
think if you use them well, there's a lot of heavy lifting. If it's transactional, there's not much heavy lifting. And I think the question is, where are you in your thought process with that? John, we're coming to the end of our podcast, and it's just been fantastic to hear the different perspectives and your experiences and also your thoughts. If you could set one clear North Star for ethical, practical student AI use, what would it be and why?
I think I'd go back to the metaphor I talked about with the fitness tracker. If it's too easy, you probably haven't learned anything. And I think what you need to do is make sure that you get that friction. It has to be difficult for you to learn. There has to be some struggle. It doesn't need to be too difficult. We don't want to overcomplicate matters. And actually, one of the things we can do is reduce that cognitive load so that it's the germane cognitive load that we retain, but we have to have that cognitive load. So for students, it would always be, you need to do the thinking, you need to do the work. And every word of something that you write down, it needs to be yours, because it's your thoughts we're interested in. By all means, have something to assist the way you develop your thoughts, but it's your thoughts I'm interested in. And they'll only get better the more you think.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that for teachers too?
And I would say that for teachers too as well. Yeah, it has to be, if it's too easy, and there are times when we want it to be easy, that's
fair enough.
fine, provided we know. If it's that repetitive, that thing, oh crikey, I've got to fill this form in again, that information's there, well, it's fine for the machine to move it from there to there, but use it to help you think. I think more deeply now about my teaching than I've ever done before, because I've got the time and the space and the tools to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it can be very enriching. I just want to remind the audience, in the show notes, you also have John Dolman's LinkedIn. Definitely connect with him, because what he shares, articles, thought partners, and also some of the questions, and he shares a lot reflections of what he's doing with the kids, and I always enjoy that. So definitely reach out to John through LinkedIn, and I know he'll be happy to connect to you, or even if you'd like him to come and speak with you. I really enjoyed the panel that we did together and the keynotes. That was really fun. Again, to the audience, thank you. Many of you, again, are commenting, sharing through the LinkedIn group. That's kind of the go-to place. So if you go to International Schools Podcast LinkedIn, we've been getting messages, and some guests are coming based on the conversations. So that's a good space. Sometimes people are like, well, I want to be on the podcast. You just need to know we book kind of ahead of time, because we work with different time zones, different people. So it's not that we don't want you, but sometimes it's just a matter of being patient, and we'll get back to you. But definitely thank you for your continued support. And if you like the conversations that we're having, especially the one with John, just go on your podcast and say you enjoyed talking or listening to what we were saying. But thank you, everybody. And John, again, thank you so much. And I want to thank you for keeping me always on my toes with your thoughtful reflections and comments and share outs on LinkedIn. It's really appreciated.
Thank you very much.